through this and get you home to dinner. So this is the agenda. I'll start out with, you can read it yourself to see what we're going to talk about. And on introductions, I'm Holly Cannon, Executive Director of Klamath Water and Power Agency. And the Klamath Water and Power Agency was established in 2008 as by the irrigation districts. We now have 7-member irrigation districts, and through the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement, WAPA has the responsibility for developing the on-project plan, and Greg's going to talk about that in a second here. So that's a reminder. I guess everybody's already doing it. The cell phone's on vibrate. So. Anyway, so Greg Addington from Klamath Water Users is here. He negotiated the agriculture portion, the on-project portion of the KBRA, and he'll be talking in a minute. The on-project plan is funded by Bureau of Reclamation, and we have retained a consultant team to help us establish that plan. The lead of the team is Mark Van Camp, who a lot of you know from MBK Engineers. MBK has done a lot of work in the Klamath Basin over the last 15 years. How long, Mark?
Since about 96.
96. Mark prepared the adjudication claims for several of the districts here, and started working here in Midland Lake. He has a team to do this on-project plan. Mark Oliver from CH2M Hill. Then there's, and each one of them will talk a little more about what their part of this is. They've also teamed with Houston Engineering. Mark Deutschman is not here because Houston is in Milwaukee or someplace, Wisconsin. So Dan Keppen couldn't be here. He's our communication consultant, and Bill Ganong is our legal counsel, and he's not here either. So Greg, going to talk about where this began. Can you read the pointer?
I'm just going to take a second. I'm Greg Addington with the Klamath Water Users Association. And they asked me to just give a little background of how we got here and what the purpose of this all is. And I mean, you guys have all seen and read or heard or know about the KBRA, and that's really not the purpose of this meeting. A portion of the KBRA contemplated the water users themselves, the districts and the irrigators, being involved in developing a plan to how we go forward. I mean, and frankly, with or without the KBRAs, I think it's a good idea to have some kind of a plan that, there are going to be years that are challenging for us, and we're better off if we have information and we have things in place developed by people on the ground that know how the water works here. And that was a big component, priority I should say, for the water users when we were working on the negotiations, was controlled by irrigators. The decision making on aligning the supply with demand would be controlled by irrigators. I think it's easy to forget that back in 2002, the Bureau of Reclamation had a water bank. remember, I mean, this was part of the National Marine Fisheries Service, it was actually part of a biological opinion. So you had the federal government, frankly, in Arcata, California, National Marine Fisheries, dictating that the Bureau of Reclamation would operate up to a 100,000-foot water bank. So the Bureau was doing groundwater pumping, the Bureau was paying for land idling, and there was, you know, there was criticism, there was concern about paper water versus real water, and so that was one of the things we said, is we don't want to go there again, we want to have control of this thing and try to make it work. So you can see the key provisions there, but I just wanted to give you that context. That's what this is about. This is a good idea. Our board of directors, the cooperative board, I think thinks this is a good thing for the community to get involved, do some of the hard work, look at some of the issues, and try to come out with a plan, regardless of what happens long term with the settlement agreements. So that's how we got here.
Thanks, Greg. Like Holly said, I'm Mark Van Camp, MBK Engineers. I've been involved in the basin since filing the claims back in the mid-90s. Wanted to add a little bit more emphasis on the team. Us and CH2M Hill prepared a basin-wide plan down in the Sac Valley for those contractors along the Sac River, long-term settlement contractors. That was a big step. It was a large area where there's water used and reused throughout the basin. That was more for a contract renewal issue. I think it established a lot of good experience that we can apply up here in this basin, along with some water transfer experience that I've been involved in NCH that includes some modeling on groundwater issues, on how to use the groundwater resource in a sustainable manner, and relationship between groundwater and surface water. So that, along with our other team members, Dan Keppen in the communication side, and Mark Deutschman bringing some experience from other parts of the United States, I think will prove very useful. As Holly mentioned, went through the agenda. It's quite an agenda. It's a lot of material. Being an engineer, I'm going to have a few graphs and maps. I'm good with those, not so good with the words, but I'll do my best to explain things, and hopefully it gets the point across. I got a certain break in here where I get to the one graph that's of a lot of complications, and I want to take questions at that point on that graph, just so you guys can understand it. Because I'm still trying to figure it out myself. No, just kidding. So the key is, I'm going to move through this agenda pretty fast. And the key, I want to get to the questions and comments and try to address those as they relate to the on-project plan. We're here to prepare this plan, as Greg said. Whether or not there's a firm water supply under the KBRA or not, it's always wise to have a plan in a drought year. So our goal is to prepare a plan that will be useful under both conditions, with or without a plan. So let me just kind of give you a quick, some of you, well, probably not many of you can see that map. It's on here. I'm going to just kind of talk from it. You can see Upper Klamath Lake up top. I have the main diversions that are defined in the KBRA, which defines the on-project plan area. Generally, the on-project plan area is the area that has historically relied on Klamath River and Upper Klamath Lake water. Okay? So the water coming out of A Canal and delivering water to KID and the various districts that rely on that system. And as that water moves down through the system into Tule Lake and the Tule Lake sumps, that is all part of the on-project plan area. It does not cover this area, the lower Klamath Refuge area, but it does cover the KDD area served by the North and Addie Canal. And we also have a few folks on the other side of the river, the Pioneer, Johnston, and Modoc Lumber Company on that side that are also part of the on-project plan area defined in the KBRA. There's a relationship in the on-project plan and living within the water supply allocation that's defined in there between the Lower Klamath Refuge and the on-project plan area. But I'm not going to get into those details because this is the first meeting to try to tell you where we're at, where we're going. It's to set the direction. That relationship between the refuge and the water users is going to get developed as we move forward. I can tell you that if we include that refuge, the analysis of water supply to you folks looks better as we develop that relationship. Okay, so I am talking more today from more of a worst case scenario to try to describe the on-project plan. So that is the general area and the coordination with Fish and Wildlife area, Fish and Wildlife Refuge. The QAPA board knew that this plan, and I welcome it, and it needs to happen. It needs to be ground truth by you folks on the ground. It shouldn't just be written or dictated by a small group of folks or certainly by your consultants. We're here to work with you, develop a plan that works for you folks, and to learn from you, and certainly from the experiences that have occurred since 2001, because you have done a lot to help meet your needs. And I view it as we're building on that. So this is a list of the districts and companies that form what we call the OPPC, the On-Project Plan Advisory Committee. They're advisory to us. We hold meetings. We have held 3 meetings to develop the first tech memo. Tech memo 1, we're going to go into that a little bit more in more detail just to describe what we're doing, but we're doing a whole series of tech memos. The first one was prepared and presented to the OPPC to help get their insight, tell them how we think we should proceed, and make sure they were on board with the process we plan to undertake. So having a committee like this is of utmost importance to me, because this plan has to be something that works for you folks and later approved through the process. Part of that first tech memo was, in my goal, the main objective, not only to line out the path from which we go forward, how we proceed with this, it was the approval by the QAPA board on what the goals and objectives are. This is in writing, been approved by the QAPA board, and can you see it in the back there? Because I don't want to read it to you, but I have highlighted some of the key words. You know, the long-term sustainability of agriculture, equitable treatment amongst districts. Of course, the overall objective is to align water supply and demand. That's the purpose of this on-project plan. We're minimize third-party impacts, avoid adverse impacts to the groundwater, and of course use the groundwater in a long-term sustainable manner. And that includes areas adjacent to the on-project plan area. That is something that was added by the OPPC committee and said, we need to, you know, not only, there's groundwater wells on the perimeter that we need to also be cautious of. I'm sorry, I got to go back and forth with my glasses nowadays. Okay. Here's the difficult slide. I'm going to try to explain it so that I can get the point across, and so we can move to other slides. On the x-axis is the March 1st forecast to Upper Klamath Lake for April through September. It goes from 0, hopefully we haven't had any of those years, out to 900. Historically, we haven't had any of those years either. We've had a pretty wet year out there. I'm not too sure what year that is, 83, 86 or something. But this is a forecasted inflow to Upper Klamath Lake for the period April through September. That's in thousands of acre feet. Here on the y-axis, I want to note that we start at 200,000. We go up to 500,000. This is an estimate of our March through October diversions. okay? Under the KBRA, there is a firm water supply from the Klamath River and Upper Klamath Lake, based on this forecast. So March 1 forecast comes in at 200,000 acre feet. We would receive a firm supply of 340,000 acre feet. That's this blue line. The limitation on ag diversions, okay? So you can see during drier years, we're at 340,000. It slopes up during the middle portion, and in the wet years out here, it's up to 385,000. That is ag only, okay? Recall I mentioned the interaction with the lower Klamath refuge. Another supply of water between 48 and 60,000 is added on this with a commitment by the on-project plan folks to provide that water to them at 2 locations currently. Addy Canal at the state line and D-Plan. So some of that water, we as the water users get to use first and then provide to them. Okay, that relationship's getting worked out all through this on-project plan. What I've plotted in the green diamonds are the diversions that we've seen historically from 1961 to 2000. So you can see the general trend, as you might suspect. In drier years, we're diverting more water. Wetter years, we divert less. Kind of obvious. And I want to just point out this is just an estimate of your demand. We're still, through TM2, the tech memos, we're working on understanding the water supply and demand. There's anomalies in here. The lake could have been low in late September, and maybe your deliveries would have been higher. There's situations like that. So, you know, we have to deal with that to make this, improve upon this estimate. So, if the KBRA had been in place, in a year like this one here, the allocation or the supply available to us would have been 340,000. The demand was over 400,000. The purpose of the on-project plan in a future year like that would be to develop methods on how to meet that additional demand. Okay? What are the things we can do to live with this firm Klamath River supply? I want to note that this is only 61 to 2000. I probably don't have to tell any of you in this room what happened in 2001. And I didn't put numbers up here for 2002 on because it gets really complicated. You'll get diversions out of the river down here, but you folks did a lot of activities to meet your demand, hopefully most of it. And I just want to share one example, and that's 2010. In 2010, with all the restrictions, the limitation on your diversions, the actual diversions in 2010 were, from the river now, were 220,000 acre feet. That's how much you restricted. And through the water bank activities, the groundwater pumping, the crop idling, and whatever other activities took place up here in 2010, we estimate you folks generated 180,000 acre feet of water. So if you assume that total is your demand, so 220 plus 180 gets you right up around 400,000 acre feet as an estimated demand. Had the KBRA been in place in that year, and we were operating under the on-project plan, the March 1st forecast was right around 340, say, or 330, excuse me, and that would have got us a supply of about 345,000 acre feet of water pursuant to that settlement. With that, we would have only had to generate 55,000 acre feet of supplemental supply, if my math is close to right. So what that tells me is in 2010, you folks did a lot more activities to to generate supplemental water supply that you would have had to under the KBRA. Just as one example. And we could, I couldn't do it tonight, but we can in the future and need to in the development of the OPP, look at all the other years, 2002 to 2010, and understand those activities and learn from them to develop the OPP. Okay, keep in mind, those diversions are just an estimate of your demand. Okay, we're working to firm those up and understand it for planning crews. I'll just stop here and let some questions come up and see if we can clarify this graph, if there's any concern. And if there's no questions, it means you're either asleep, because I know I didn't do that good a job. We're good? The yellow bars means the quantity of water that we have to generate through the OPP when the KBRA and the river allocation, firm water supply from the river is in place.
Hey, Mark,
Yes.
I think you already said this with the 2010, but in a drier year where you have that point above the line, there down close, right? So it doesn't mean, if that's our demand, it doesn't mean today that that's what we get.
Oh, correct. And that's why, that is why
Whether
it only
that's
goes
right
to
or wrong, I'm just saying, the way things are today.
and that's why 2001 to 2010
That's my question again, as you work all this up, we've got a big plan here, but if there's no way maybe they can come in and interject us with a lawsuit and shut us down again? Are we gonna get all that stopped in all this agreements?
Well, Joe, I can't tell you that nobody can, you can't do anything that's going to prevent anybody's right to sue, including us. And so, but what the agreement does is it's, you get all those parties who have typically been on the end of those lawsuits who are now signed on with us on this agreement. So to me, the worry shifts from those parties who we've had to worry about in the past to outside parties that haven't signed on to this. And I mean, the simple version is, what the agreement says is now the three tribes that signed it and the other conservation groups and whoever it might be, that outside lawsuit from Oregon Wild or Water Watch comes, those parties are coming into the courtroom to defend this agreement with us. And we've never had something like that, for better or worse either.
Okay, so now explain to us, you were just saying, if you were agreed that we get 300, March 1st is 300,000, but we need 380, how much longer time does that take through the season to know that you're going to get that other 60,000 feet of water?
That's part of the plan. That's what we're working towards. How do we find that other 60,000?
No, how do you guarantee that 60,000 ain't going to be? What
That's
we're saying,
part
we
of
know
the
what the
plan.
inflows are, we know what the historical flows are in the rivers. So why is it so difficult to come up to tell us it's going to be hard to ensure that 65 feet? That's what I'm hearing from you guys.
It's not difficult. But Mark will go into that in the next few slides here, where that extra water is going to come from.
I hope, if I understand your question, I think that will
Well, we know the
cover.
snowpacks, that's where the water comes from anyway.
Well, this is our river supply.
It's snowpack.
And, right, and we need to come up with, other than Klamath River, Klamath Lake water to make up these yellow bars. That's what we need to do in the on-project plan. And that's what we're talking about. Okay. I took those supplemental water supplies that you saw up there, those yellow bars, for this period of time from 1961 to 2000. Didn't write in all the years because you couldn't read it. And just put them in chronological order. What supplemental water supply do we need above that Klamath River water to make our estimated demands whole? And so this is how my engineering mind works, is we need to figure out that, where is that supplemental water supply coming from? I have to look at it in a chronological order, okay? But first I look at it and I look at this and I say, well, 15 out of the 40 years, we need supplemental water. there's 15 bars there. The pattern is critical because I have shown on here, I have also added in 1992, 94, there's an added complexity of what is called an extreme drought. Now, that gets to a level of detail that I don't want to get into tonight, but there's other activities that occur, extra precautions through the KBRA, but those quantities are in here as well in 1992 and 94. You can see in the range in the first series of years, roughly something under 40,000 in those 2 years. Many years, the river supply under the KBRA is adequate to meet your demand. Then we get to the critical drought period of, say 87 through 94, and we have supplemental water needs of up to 110,000 acre-feet of water. We're going to talk about how we get there in a second. I will emphasize to you that you folks, like I said in 2010, you've done that. Now, we don't want to have to do it back-to-back years because I would suggest that groundwater pumping to that extent is not sustainable. But that's what we have to learn through the preparation of this plan. So now I'm going to just ask Mark, and we're going to get into more details about what our tools are to do that. But Mark's going to talk, Mark Oliver from CH Swim Health is going to talk a little bit about the process we're going through with the OPPC committee and the various tech memos.
So I'll keep this real short, but just so you know kind of what we're doing and why. So like Mark said, the first step was to put together the TM stands for technical memorandum. It's basically the document put together. So the first thing was coming up with the goals and objectives, and Mark went through that, where kind of the root of everything that's being looked at is got to maintain a sustainable agricultural economy up here, and we want to make sure that we don't have, any groundwater use is going to be sustainable, and any impacts are minimized. So that's a starting point. So where we are right now then is in what's called phase 2. So we're taking a hard look at, okay, what are the supplies right now, and where will they be in the future? What's the demand for water by district, so we can match those two things up. We're also trying to get a good handle on baseline conditions. Where are we right now with biological opinion? Where are we in the future when KBRA is fully implemented? And then from there, we're going to be going into comparing those sorts of things. So we'll look at, like I said, we'll look at demand at a district level. We'll look at supply at a district level. What could potentially be done differently as far as management? That's going to lead to our options. And the options, Mark will go into this, but there'll be things like use of groundwater. Where can potentially we have some improved, kind of a conservation project at a district level? What we think in a lot of cases, because this basin's so efficient already, is a lot of those things at the district level might have a district benefit, but when we get to the overall area, there's really not a whole lot of benefit. But that's something we've got to prove out here, because that question's going to be asked. Then we're going to be looking at in what we call TM7. That's when we'll look at all those options and put them together. Some mix of groundwater, some mix of again, conservation or storage or other potential options. At the same time, and we kind of started this right now, we have to start the environmental process. So I'll be going into that in a little bit. But essentially, because Bureau of Reclamation is helping fund this, and then CWAPA's got a responsibility in the California portion as well, we're just starting to look at, okay, we got to put together an environmental document, which again, I mentioned I'll go into in a bit. And then we're going to finish up with the summary report overall, which the intent is we're going to end up with a lot of information, because a lot of folks are going to look at this, and again, they're going to want to dig in. How did you come up with this number? Why didn't you look at this? This is basically where we've got to go right now. The summary report will be something that the common person can actually understand and read. It won't be, for us geek engineers are the kind of people that are going to really try and dig in. So Mark, I'm going to hand it back to you here as far as the options.
I can see we've done this once now, and we're already overlapping on things we say. So I'll in the KBRA, for preparation of the on-project plan, there's a whole list of things that it says we are to review in preparation of the on-project plan. I look at those, there's a few that stand out to me from memory, or forbearance agreement, easements, things like that. To me, those options identified in that settlement agreement boil down to these 4 items that we are to look at. I put them into conservation / efficiency measures, canal lining, system improvement. Like Mark said, the goal of the OPP is to live within that diversion limit. So if a conservation or efficiency measure doesn't do anything to help those diversions up at the A canal or those other points, it's not critical for the on-project plan. It may be important for you as an individual irrigator to undertake that measure. It may be important for your district, but it may not do anything to help the overall reduction of diversions or to live within that. Just as one example, a efficiency measure by a district to reduce its drain flow might just require another district to divert more water out of one of those measured locations. So the net impact of diversions could be zero, even though the upstream district is looking better from an efficiency standpoint. Okay, but we are not putting a lot of weight on those. Bureau of Reclamation is doing studies right now that from their Denver office. They have a whole list of options, various conservation and efficiency measures that they're looking at and studying, and propose to have some reports for us to review spring or summer of next year. Groundwater, and that includes pumping of groundwater, conjunctive use, groundwater banking, but it all boils down to the use of groundwater. Groundwater wells and use obviously have increased in this basin since 2001. I think between the reports of OWRD, the USGS, there's a lot of information out there. We are in preparing the on-project plan to rely on the USGS report that is yet to come out yet, but is forthcoming, we understand, towards the first of next year. I want to say something I think Mark said last night at least, and we need to make sure we emphasize. We're not trying to create anything new here. This basin has been studied quite a bit by USGS, the Extension Center, the Cal Poly ITRC, a lot of good folks, and we have a whole resource index that we pulled up first to start reviewing that material. We're not trying to create anything new. We're trying to rely on some of that past stuff, bring it to the OPAC, and make sure it's ground truth. Additional storage. That is supposed to be investigated, looked at. I don't think that's necessarily in the financial means for the on-project plan to help us. It would be very difficult in the Klamath River to find new storage that would be acceptable, certainly considering we are tied to a supply based on Upper Klamath Lake influence. But that could include storage elsewhere, another source. I don't know if there is another source, a small reservoir. Maybe it's a regulatory reservoir that somebody wants to consider storage. A regulating reservoir that will allow more efficient use. I may throw that into the conservation section, but some might call that storage. We are just prompted to investigate storage. Demand reduction, it is down here on the bottom of the list for a reason, because certainly QAPA's board of directors, through the goals and objectives, that is the last thing we want to do. Okay? The goal is to minimize any reduction of ag in trying to find the supplemental water supply to meet our needs. We are developing a list of options based on those 4 categories that form various alternatives. Because remember, we've got to keep this thing very flexible. Because any one year, it may, depending on the sequence of hydrology, we may have to use a different group of options. Pumping groundwater in one area, maybe an efficiency project in other areas, and if it's one of those bad years, we may have to put some lands out of production in a temporary idling program. The key here is that the options are to be voluntary. If somebody in this basin doesn't want to do it to help meet the goal of satisfying the demands of the whole basin, of that on-project plan area, they won't have to do it. It's not, it's voluntary, it's not involuntary. And it is to be compensated. The idea is the funding to become available to incentivize folks to want to help meet the demand of the whole group. So there's the options. I want to just, as a complete example of this, and I assure you these are numbers. What I did with those supplemental water supplies that we talked about earlier for the 40 years, I ranked them. So you can see all these years, there is 25 years, there's no shortage, no supplemental water supply. Okay, then we have those other years that we had some small supplemental water supply needed, and then we had those big years. Okay, this is all conceptual. Recall I said that max was about 110. You can see the 110,000 over here. As I said, I believe the basin is very efficient. There's reports supporting that. The Cal Poly ITRC shows how efficient this project is. Yet there's people out there that think there's a lot of water to be gained. Okay? I, as my example, said, well, what if we, with all your help, can find efficiency projects that would result in reduced diversions at those locations of 15,000 acre-feet of water. That is my guesstimate, okay? If that was to occur, that would take care of 3 of those years where that shortage or supplemental water supply was needed, okay? This is purely conceptual here. I have been following the work by the USGS. I'm aware of the groundwater pumping that you folks have done since 2001. We recently prepared a report trying to quantify that. We have numbers trying to gather the data from OWRD, QAPA, and the next step up I took was assume 50,000 acre-feet of groundwater pumping could occur. That 50,000 took care of this group of years. That's another 8 years of those 15 years of shortages, okay? Of course, back to the concern I have about the sequence of hydrology. We've got to worry about that. 50,000, I've heard numbers stated that might be a doable number in that order of magnitude on an average annual basis. But unfortunately, from a hydrology standpoint, we don't get to work on an average annual basis. So then, in these years, 4 years out of 40, there is, in this example, the potential of having to compensate, request a voluntary reduction of irrigation on land with compensation. That is 4 out of 40. So let me just emphasize that I know it's tough not to look at those 4 years. Those 4 years would be tough. I hope we don't get there. I hope I'm wrong with these numbers and we can generate more water with those 2 bottom objectives. The other thing I'd point out that 25 of the 40 years are essentially business as usual, as it was in the past with that KBRA water supply. Okay, so that's an example of the options we're considering. You'll see I did not include storage in here just because I don't have a viable storage project in my mind at this time. And we are looking for one, so if anybody has one, let's discuss it and get it on the table. Now we're going to step back and go to the environmental review process. And Mark, I think you're going to cover this for us.
So I mentioned this before, as far as, this hasn't started yet, but because there's federal money here, Bureau of Reclamation's involved, they're going to want to see that this goes through the environmental process, as well as the state process in California, because QAPA spans both California and Oregon. They will then be the lead for the California portion of this. So the California piece is called the California Environmental Quality Act, and that's where QAPA will be the lead agency and can help drive this. And then the federal act is called the National Environmental Policy Act. That's what makes you do EIS. And that would be led by then Reclamation. So it'll be a joint thing where QAPA is going to be working together with Reclamation. So for that to start, we have to have, like Mark's walked through, the options and alternatives have to come together in a way that we actually know what we're analyzing. So that's supposed to happen in fall of next year. So this document wouldn't start until that time. We'll be talking about, as far as the public scoping meetings, a meeting like this, but it'll be for that environmental document, talking about a lot of the same issues. Essentially what this document would do is it would lay out, for instance, what Mark talked about, and I personally think we're going to want to show, in some cases, here's an amount of fallowing land, because we want to show what those impacts would be. Because in a document like this, it's not going to be just, impacts to fish, or it's going to be impacts to habitat. There's also going to be a piece, the social part of this, and that's where you have the ability to show the impacts to, if this much land were to come out even for a year, here's what it would do to the local economy. And again, those are the sorts of things I think that folks are going to want to show, and this is the document to do it. Now, as far as this is our last slide we got, and then we'll go into the questions. As far as the schedule, phase 1, we finished that up in August. That was, we talked about that TM1, the goals and objectives. Phase 2, we're looking to have that done in spring of next year. And that will be the water supply and the demand, and then the baseline conditions. We're hoping we'll have a pretty good portion of that done in spring of next year. Phase 3 is then the end of next year. That's when we'll have what we're calling the flow path. That's when we basically compare the supply and demand, look at how the water's moving, how can we potentially improve management. In some cases we'll see opportunities, in other cases we'll say there's really nothing more that can be done. And the options are coming together. And then phase 4, basically the completion of the on-project plan. That will happen in 2013. And that's when we'll have all our alternatives put together, and we'll put together our summary document overall.
The only other thing to add to those phases, Mark, is just to emphasize, I mentioned the OPAC meetings. We have those meetings during those phases, but right now we've only worked with OPAC and Holly to really outline through phase 2 of that. So before we move into phase 3, we'll be sitting down with Holly and directions he's received from his board and members of the OPPC committee to really better outline phase 3. But we're trying to just keep the input coming from the community and that ground truth through the OPPC committee. So,
can I jump in because you guys screwed up? Really important, if you go back to the last slide, this is the first public meeting we've had under this process, and we'll be having one of those, at least one of these in every phase, and probably 2 in the final one. So that's the intent, is as well as OPAC meetings are open to the public. And while this is going on, anyone who has any questions and all can certainly refer these things to Holly. And this is a long process, and we're looking for folks' input. So I want to make sure and reinforce that.
So we want to open it up to questions about the preparation of the OPP.